Hi students, and welcome to chapter 4, our first lecture on biodiversity. We're lucky we live on such an awesome planet, and this is not as much my specialty, but I'll do my best to walk you through it. Most of this is going to be a review of your biology class from 10th grade. So first, biodiversity. You should know that there's three main branches of life, but there's really only two types of life. And what I mean by that, as far as at the cellular level, there is something called prokaryotes, which are considered pretty primitive, and they are the makeup bacteria and archaea, two of the main branches of life. And then there's eukaryotes. And the difference between the two is that prokaryotes don't really have differentiated organelles. They don't have much internal structure compared to the eukaryotes. So where does this come into play? Is that this is what, when you learn about the tree of life, I think in some of your earlier biology classes, they tend to focus on this branch over here, like 5 of the 6 kingdoms are eukaryotes, because this is all of our multicellular life. So when you're looking at the cellular level, the eukaryotes, the more advanced or more compartmentalized cells make up all of our advanced life. Everything that's beyond a single-celled organism are eukaryotes. And so all of the things that you think about when you think about biodiversity on planet Earth, you're thinking about eukaryotes. But if you're a biologist and you're actually looking at true biodiversity and just sheer numbers of life on Earth, it is these two branches, the bacteria and the archaea, that far outweigh the eukaryotes in numbers and types. And the archaea is something that you may be less familiar with, but we think that life actually started on planet Earth with the archaea, both because if you think about the branches of this tree being how far away we are from this common ancestor, which we think now goes back almost 4 billion years, the archaea are the most ancient ones we have. And so as you branch off in the types of archaea, you see things that like salt, things that like heat, things that live off of methane. There are life forms that are very different from what we consider most life, which is oxygen-loving, oxygen-breathing, or oxygen-producing plants. So the archaea, the word archaea means ancient, and the archaea are considered probably were the original life forms on planet Earth. And I think you probably know about bacteria and you know enough about the other ones. But let's get into the actual depth of like, what is a species anyway? So a species is a distinct kind of organisms, and if it's sexually reproducing, it means that they can produce a fertile offspring. So while you can get species interbreeding between each other, they usually do not produce fertile offspring. Any offspring they have will be infertile. So the example of horses and donkeys, they can interbreed to produce mules, but the mules themselves cannot produce offspring. So it turns out that this is actually more common than I ever knew, like when I was first getting into teaching AP Environmental Science. So while this happens, it's just that most of these are going to be evolutionary dead ends, and it's because the chromosomes don't line up completely, and so that ability of those genes to get passed on to the next generation is just not there. So a lot of species do have mechanisms in place to prevent this interbreeding. I'll let you read the slide for yourself. But occasionally this might actually be a source of a new species. So that's a picture of a zorse. And at one point I had a student say, that's so not a real animal. And so I Googled it and look at all these zorses. I just think this biology really kind of amazes me. So anyway, those are just some pictures of some zorses. So again, zebra and a horse, not going to be able to have offspring themselves, but they can interbreed to produce zorses. Okay, so evolution. There are 2 different levels of evolution is the way I like to look at it. Microevolution, which is what's going on at a gene level. And this usually produces short-term evolutionary changes. And if you get enough of them, you can have macroevolution, which is the formation of a new species from, some ancestral species. So one microevolution is going to lead to macroevolution if you get enough of those changes taking place so that what you have is reproductively isolated from the species that came before it. So what drives this process? What drives microevolution? Mutations. And even now, as you look at the coronavirus, there's been many, many mutations. And so they can actually tell which coronavirus strands came from China, which ones came from Europe. And as time goes on, we're finding more and more of these mutations within the coronavirus that produces slightly different strains of that virus. And then natural selection. The ones that are most successful at reproducing are going to be the ones that produce, that continue on. Okay, so the mutations is pretty easy to understand. There are 3 things you need for natural selection. One is variability. If you don't have any differences in your genes, you're not going to get any kind of change going on. The other one is that it's got to be able to be passed down to the next generation. So it's got to be heritable. So it's got to be a trait that you can pass along. And then there's got to be some advantage to it. So there's got to be some kind of differential reproduction, and that trait is actually going to make your species more successful than other traits. So there's this one theory that they like you to know for the AP test, and that is the writings of it. They call it Malthusian theory after this guy, Thomas Malthus. And he was an economist that noted that populations will always tend to reproduce in an exponential sort of way. However, resources can never last forever if you have exponential growth. And so that leads to a struggle for survival. Okay, so this is also just kind of history-wise, kind of your classic example of natural selection taking place. The peppered moth originally looked like that guy in the upper part of the photo to the right there, and it was because that coloration, that peppered color, allowed that moth to blend in with lichens and whatnot, and it made it hard for birds to find them. However, in the 1800s, when the Industrial Revolution took off in England, and everything started to get coated with soot, so all of your buildings and whatnot started to turn black, it turned out that the black peppered moth was the one that became more successful at surviving. And so over time, the dark moths tended to become more common than the lighter peppered colored ones. Okay, so these adaptations, so this natural selection will lead to adaptations. And another classic in the history of the whole thing is, of course, Darwin, who studied the finches and the different sizes and shapes of beaks, which helped them eat different types of food. So, and then there's also related to natural selection is something called sexual selection, and that some individuals in the population will outproduce others, not due to differences in survival, but because they're better at attracting mates. And so there's just some examples of that. Okay, so what are some limits to adaptations? They can only occur if those favorable traits exist in your population to begin with. And then there's often compromises that go on. And one of the examples in the lower left is a picture of a cheetah, and that the long legs enabled it to be able to run faster than just about anything else out there, but longer legs might also leave you more prone to breaks. I think the human species in the lower right is also a great example, in that humans are one of the few mammals that walk upright. And to do that, then we needed to, if you're carrying a baby, a lot of mammals have a straight pathway for babies to be delivered, and for offspring to be delivered, and for humans that wouldn't work walking upright to hold that baby in. So we developed a curved path. The other thing is that we have very large heads, which make us very intelligent. We're able to survive. But because of that, we are actually born a little bit more premature than most mammal species are, because if our heads grew too much more, it might become dangerous for the mother if we were still inside. So that's my biology take on the whole thing as a geologist. Also this is a friend of mine's kid. He's in high school now, like you guys, but he had this thing called a snaggletooth right in the middle. So sometimes not all variations are going to be favorable, and then, not lead to reproductive success and get carried on in the population. So there's more to it than that, but that's kind of my take. The other thing that can be a limitation is reproductive rate. If you're an animal that has a very low reproductive rate, you don't have many offspring, and it takes many years to have those offspring, you're not going to adapt as quickly as, say, bacteria that can adapt within a matter of days. So we'll show you a video in class that kind of shows the kind of scary bacteria adapting to antibiotics, leading to an antibiotic resistant strains of bacteria. But because bacteria evolve very quickly, because they reproduce so quickly, they can evolve pretty quickly. Okay, so going on to the next step then, let's look at macroevolution. Is when you get enough changes over time that you actually get new species. So there's three processes involved. One is evolutionary change over time. One is the formation of new species. And then there's also the other side of that, which is going to be loss of species that are no longer able to survive in your habitat. Divergent evolution is when you get enough accumulation of differences between populations, and it can lead to speciation. So how does that actually happen? There's generally two processes. One is geographic isolation. So species living on different opposite sides of an ocean or a mountain range. And over time, they're not mixing with each other anymore. So over time, they can form new species. And then if that happens, and they might evolve to be different enough that they can no longer reproduce, which means that now you are officially different species. So my favorite topic, plate tectonics, because I'm a geologist. So how has How has this driven macroevolution over time? It turns out there's more than you might think. First off, we split continents apart and then create new oceans. And so this is happening in the East Rift Valley in Africa right now. Eventually that will become a new ocean. But the Atlantic Ocean, you probably have seen the whole Pangea thing down here where those continents used to be together. And there were species that they find fossils of the same species crossing these continents. But when the continents split, those species became isolated. So you can also, the plate tectonics also drives the creation of mountain chains, which can also geographically isolate species. And then also the motion of continents will shift your climates over time because where the oceans are is going to affect how they circulate, which drives a lot of our climate. And yeah, and then, and the one bullet point I forgot was that continents can also themselves shift to new climates. So Antarctica used to be a lot more warm than it is now. It didn't used to sit right over the South Pole, but over time, as this rift opened down here, Antarctica moved south while Australia and India moved north. So Earth, we're kind of lucky again. We live in what they call the Goldilocks zone for life. So as always, my other favorite topic being planetary stuff and astronomy stuff, we're just the right distance from the sun to have liquid water, which we think is pretty necessary for life, or at least like makes it a lot easier. We're just the right size, so we have enough gravity to hold an atmosphere. And also two things, we can hold on to our atmosphere, which protects us from radiation from the sun, but also it keeps our core molten, which our molten core gives us our magnetic field, which actually keeps our atmosphere from getting stripped away. Mars's core froze, and so they no longer have that, and most of their atmosphere has been stripped away as a result. We rotate, so these are things that more give like biodiversity. We rotate, so we get like seasonal or daily patterns of night and day. We tilt and orbit the sun, which gives us our seasons. And then again, our atmospheric evolution, the generation, we never used to have oxygen in our atmosphere. So it was the evolution of plants that kicked that off, that now give us a 21% oxygen atmosphere so that animals like us can survive. So if we compare us to other planets, like why is that all so special? So again, Mars was too little and it was too far from the sun, so it's very cold, and it was too little, so its core froze, so it lost most of its atmosphere. We think Mars was once much more Earth-like than it is today. There is evidence that there's probably still some water. There's a lot of ice on Mars, that there might still be some liquid water beneath the surface, but it's a lot more inhospitable than it used to be. Also of interest in our solar system, moons of Jupiter. We're now seeing that there's evidence of liquid oceans underneath their icy surfaces. And what creates these, they're all way too little to have a molten core, at least produced by just the gravitational collapsing of the planet. But we think that that liquid water in there is actually produced by tidal forces, that Jupiter is so huge that its gravity flexes the planet enough that it actually is enough to melt water, all that friction force. Same thing with Saturn. We're now seeing that we have some moons of Saturn that look like they might have liquid water. And then Titan has liquid methane. We're not sure if that's conducive to life, but you know, it could be. So you are living in exciting times for exploring our other moons and planets of our own solar system for life. And of course, we mentioned Venus in class with the phosphate in the atmosphere. So coming back to Earth, co-evolution is when interactions between two species result in ongoing changes. So there's two types. Mutualistic, meaning they're both helping each other out, and the evolutionary arms race, which is like the predator-prey relationship. And so let's kind of walk through both of those. The mutualistic one is where one species helps the other. So the Andean bat evolved a really long tongue to be able to get its tongue down the super long tube of this flower. The bat gets to eat and the flower gets that specialized pollinator. The bat must be better at it than other types of insects and birds, etc. So it can also be the other side where you get the predator-prey relationship. So thorns, toxins that are developed by plants and animals to keep prey away. And so what happens then is the prey might get adapted to that. And you can even think about the antibiotic-resistant bacteria as another example of that predator-prey relationship. So, and again, these changes happen through natural selection over time. All right, so when you look at it, it says convergent evolution, which is different than co-evolution, results in similarities between different groups. So this is when you have two like animals or plants that are not at all related, but they evolve to have similar characteristics, and they often live in completely different parts of the planet. So anteaters and aardvarks, they look really similar, even though their closer relatives don't have that snout. Whales are and fish are like one's mammals and one's fish. So again, very, very different, but they've evolved to to have similar traits. And so what causes that is that they're sharing similar niches, so similar roles in their environment. And again, biology stuff, I think it's kind of cool. So here's just a bunch of examples of convergent evolution. So you got your penguins and your sea lions all have that kind of, to be able to stay warm, that kind of thick, blubbery, outside. Euphorbia versus cactus, like I would have called that a cactus. But anyway, pill bugs, pill millipedes look really similar. And it's interesting, I'm going to show you a couple examples where the reptilian example is now extinct. So we have three, a mammal, a dolphin, a shark, which is a fish, and actually an ichthyosaur, which is an extinct dinosaur that used to swim in the oceans. So again, they look really similar, but they couldn't be more different because one's a fish, one's a reptile, one's a mammal. Similarly, flying things besides swimming things. So falcon is a bird, a bat is a mammal, and again, extinct, the pterodactyls. So again, they all have very similar wing structures. And then we have the flying squirrel versus the sugar glider, like they look really similar. These three, the wolf, the spotted hyena, and the marsupial tiger, also extinct. Again, sharing similar niches, and so they have similar traits. And then the idea of echolocation, both in air by bats and then in water. Okay, so when you think about, these are terms that people often get confused, coevolution and convergent evolution. So as far as which one results in symbiotic relationships, that would be coevolution because they're working together, which could result in specialists. DeBrew and I kind of differed in this one. I think both can lead to specialists, which means species that are very good at what they do. They're very adapted to their habitats. And then which could occur in species in separate ecosystems can only be convergent evolution, because coevolution assumes that you're working together in some way, either the symbiotic or the predator-prey type thing. Okay, so another one of my favorite topics, extinction. It's actually not such a great topic to be fond of. There's background extinction, which means all the time things are going extinct. So there's always going to be a loss of species over time as conditions change or they get outcompeted, et cetera. There's also mass extinctions, which are really noticeable in our fossil record. We have these points in time where all of a sudden, like a whole lot of fossils, like we find them and then we don't find them. We don't know what causes them all. Of course, we know that the dinosaur one, which is our most recent mass extinction being 65 million years ago, was the result of an asteroid impact. It took, when I was your age, that had not been proven yet. It was a theory, but when we finally found the crater of the right age in the Yucatan Peninsula, it was pretty well proven. But other things that might cause them are the overturning of the ocean, which for a lot of our history, most of our life has been in the oceans. Catastrophic methane hydrate releases, which can lead to rapid climate changes. And there's other theories that are out there too. We've had 5 of them in the past, and they've happened kind of at random intervals. There isn't any regular pattern to these mass extinctions. And then a lot of people are arguing that we are in one right now, and they're calling it the anthropogenic or Anthropocene, that we're in a period where humans are causing a mass extinction on the planet. That's kind of up for debate. It's a philosophical question. We'll be looking more at that with our Chapter 9 lecture and study. Okay, so what happens after a mass extinction? It actually is not it's not all that bad, and that you can get something called an adaptive radiation. And this line right here between the Mesozoic and the Cenozoic is when the dinosaurs went extinct. So the Mesozoic is known as the age of the reptiles. Mammals in the Mesozoic, genetically, I mean, there weren't a whole lot of them. They weren't very prevalent. So the reptiles kind of ruled the earth, and think of the Jurassic Park thing. But after the dinosaurs and a lot of reptiles went extinct because of that asteroid impact, mammals that were more easily able to survive such a catastrophic event really took off. So an adaptive radiation is when all of a sudden you get a massive explosion of different species due to something. And a mass extinction is one of the things that can trigger that. So some misconceptions, things people get wrong. So survival of the fittest doesn't mean strongest. Survival of the fittest means that you're most able to pass your genes on to the next. It's a sign of reproductive success. You're most able to pass your genes on to future generations. Other misconceptions, an individual cannot evolve, only a population. When you're talking about evolution, we're not talking about your evolution of yourself over your life. And it's situational. It doesn't always lead to changes in one direction. It can go back and forth. And one of my favorite examples of this, I think, is on the next slide, is as climate changes, as different environmental pressures change, introduction of a new species, evolution can go either way. So it's not like a one-way thing. And one of the things is thinking about phones. We went from super huge phones back in the 90s down to these super tiny. I had an iPhone 5 at one point. It was tiny. And I actually had one of those tiny little flip phones too. all the way up to now we're like at these like huge, and we're going to be coming out with the iPhone 12 and the supersize, practically like mini iPads. So there is no grand plan of nature or final goal. So things, again, can flux either way. The dinosaurs going extinct, like if we were around, nobody could have predicted that there was going to be an asteroid that would wipe out so much life on the planet. And remember that a lot of these changes are compromises. Some people feel that dinosaurs were already on the way out, the big ones, because they were too big. It takes a lot to support an animal that size in the way of resources. So adaptive changes that increase survival in a population's niche may not be advantageous if conditions change. And we'll be getting more into that as we get into, again, chapter 9 with our loss of biodiversity chapter. So this is just an ending slide from your Miller book. And I'm going to go ahead. I'm trying to get out of here so we can actually stop the video. Remember to let it go all the way to the end so you don't get kicked out of Ed Puzzle.